was just a guy in a ripped coat asking for $1, but the look in his eyes screamed a story darker than any storm. Then came the kid with a black card and zero patience for pity. What started with a grocery cart turned into a night neither of them would ever forget. But trust me, it's not what you think. Let's rewind. It was one of those bitter New York nights where the wind cuts through you like it's got a personal grudge. The streets were a mix of rushing strangers and the occasional wandering soul, all bundled up and hunched against the chill. The faint glow of streetlights barely reached the ground, and everything seemed wrapped in a kind of gray silence, broken only by the occasional honk of a taxi or the muffled conversations of passers-by. Standing outside a small cafe near the corner of 42nd Street was a man who looked like he'd been forgotten by the city itself. Michael, about 40, had once been the kind of guy who could walk into any room and own it. An engineer by trade, he had a sharp mind, a sharp suit, and what felt like a sharp future. But life doesn't always play fair. A series of layoffs, a messy divorce, and a string of bad luck had left him standing here tonight, wrapped in a worn-out gray coat, his pockets almost as empty as his stomach. 15 cents. That's all he had left. Not even enough for a cup of coffee. And after spending hours pacing up and down the streets, battling his pride, Michael finally decided to do the one thing he swore he'd never do: ask a stranger for help. He spotted his first target, a tall, well-dressed young man stepping out of a sleek black car. The kid couldn't have been older than 18, but there was something about him, an air of confidence, like he didn't just belong here, he owned the city. His coat looked expensive, his shoes even more so, and in his hand was a leather briefcase that screamed, "I don't shop on sale." Michael hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding like he was about to rob a bank. But hunger has a way of silencing your doubts. Taking a shaky breath, he approached. "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have $1?" The young man stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing, like he wasn't sure if he'd heard correctly. Slowly, he turned to face Michael, his gaze sharp and assessing. For a moment, Michael thought he had blown it. This kid was going to roll his eyes, brush him off, or worse, pretend he didn't exist. But instead, the young man did something unexpected. He asked a question. "Why $1?" the boy said, tilting his head slightly. "What are you going to do with it?" The tone wasn't mocking or rude, just curious. It threw Michael off balance. Most people either ignored him outright or gave him that pitying look, like they couldn't wait to escape. This kid was different. "Something to eat," Michael blurted out. "Just anything, really." The boy nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing the response. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet that looked like it cost more than Michael's entire wardrobe. But instead of handing over a bill, the young man paused, his eyes scanning the street like he was looking for something. "All right," he said finally, slipping the wallet back into his coat. "Come with me." Michael blinked, stunned. "What?" "You said you need food, right? Let's go," the boy said, already heading toward the glowing sign of a nearby grocery store. Michael stood frozen for a second, confusion and suspicion fighting for control. Who was this kid? And why wasn't he just giving him the $1 and walking away like everyone else? But then his stomach growled loudly enough to remind him that questions could wait. He had nothing to lose. Pulling his coat tighter around himself, Michael hurried after the young man, who didn't even glance back to see if he was following. The automatic doors of the grocery store slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in the icy wind and two mismatched figures. Barron, tall and polished like he just stepped out of a magazine, led the way with casual confidence. Behind him shuffled Michael, hesitant and out of place, his shabby coat and weathered face drawing immediate attention. As they walked in, the store's security guard perked up, his eyes locked onto Michael like a hawk spotting prey. The man didn't say anything, but the slight narrowing of his gaze and the almost imperceptible shake of his head made it clear he was ready to intervene if anything got out of line. Barron, completely unfazed, grabbed a shopping cart and gestured for Michael to follow. "All right," he said, barely glancing back. "Take whatever you need." Michael froze. He wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "What do you mean? Like anything?" Barron stopped and looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "You heard me. If you're hungry, let's fix that. Go ahead. Michael hesitated, his stomach twisting with equal parts hunger and embarrassment. Slowly, he reached for a pack of instant noodles and a bottle of water. Cheap, minimal, enough to keep him going for another day. But as he placed them into the cart, Barron stepped in, his tone firm. No, 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 Barron said, shaking his head. That's not food. Get real food, pizza, chicken, something that actually tastes like it belongs in a meal. Michael blinked, stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not with irritation, but with an almost casual authority. For a moment, he felt less like a burden and more like someone who mattered. He nodded, swallowing his pride, and began adding items to the cart. A loaf of bread, a few cans of soup, even a box of frozen burgers. Meanwhile, the security guard, still hovering nearby, let out a low, skeptical chuckle. Rich kid playing charity, huh? He muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Michael to hear. The words stung, but before Michael could react, Barron gave the guard a brief glance, a look so sharp and cold that the man immediately clammed up. By the time they reached the checkout line, the cart was full. Michael's hands shook as he looked at the total on the register. It was more than he'd seen in months, and the thought of someone spending that much on him made his throat tighten. Barron, unfazed, pulled out a sleek black card and handed it to the cashier. He barely even glanced at the amount. Bag it up, he said simply, like this was just another Tuesday. Michael stammered, Thank you. I don't even know how to. Barron cut him off with a wave of his hand. Save it, he said, grabbing the bags. But then, as they headed toward the exit, he stopped and turned back to Michael, his expression serious. Listen, Barron said, his voice low but firm. You've got food now, but you can't keep going like this. You need to clean up, get back on your feet. You have somewhere to stay? The question hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to answer but hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Who was this kid? Why was he doing all this? Seeing Michael's hesitation, Barron sighed. All right, he said, his tone softening just a bit. I know a place. It's not much, but it's better than the streets. Let's go. Michael stared at him, torn between suspicion and gratitude. But as he looked into Barron's eyes, he saw no judgment, no pity, just a quiet determination that was impossible to ignore. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said, lead the way. They stepped out into the cold night, where a sleek black SUV was waiting by the curb. The driver, an older man in a crisp suit, raised an eyebrow at the sight of Michael but said nothing. Barron opened the door and gestured for Michael to get in. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Michael sat in stunned silence, clutching the grocery bags like they were lifelines. He didn't know where they were going or what to expect, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of a small but charming hotel, the kind of place that didn't scream luxury, but had an air of quiet dignity. Warm lights glowed softly through the windows, and the sign above the door proudly announced its name in neat gold letters. Michael stepped out hesitantly, clutching the grocery bags like they were his last connection to reality. You're kidding, right? He said, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked up at the building. Barron glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. Do I look like I'm kidding? Come on, let's get you inside. Inside, the lobby was modest but clean, with polished floors and a faint smell of lavender hanging in the air. Barron approached the receptionist, who immediately straightened up at the sight of him. It was clear this wasn't the first time she dealt with someone like him, young, rich, and commanding attention without trying. One room, tonight, Barron said, sliding his sleek black card across the counter. The receptionist nodded, quick and professional. Within moments, Michael was holding a key card, staring at it like it might burn a hole through his hand. Room 204, Barron said, nodding toward the stairs. Go on, you'll find everything you need in there. Michael hesitated, his gaze flicking between Barron and the key card. Why are you doing this? He asked finally, his voice cracking slightly. Barron shrugged, like the question didn't even warrant much thought. Because I can. Now, go. With that, he turned and walked toward the lobby's seating area, leaving Michael no choice but to head upstairs. The room was small, but spotless. A cozy bed with crisp white sheets stood against one wall, and on the dresser, there was a neatly folded set of clothes, a simple shirt, jeans, and socks. The adjoining bathroom gleamed, its fixtures polished to perfection. And, most importantly, there was a steaming hot shower waiting, the water pressure strong enough to wash away years of grime and exhaustion. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael allowed himself to relax. He stepped under the shower, letting the heat seep into his aching bones, and felt the weight of the past few years begin to lift. Clean and warm, he slipped into the fresh clothes, marveling at how something so simple could feel so transformative. Sitting on the edge of the bed with a plate of food from the grocery bags, Michael felt human. Not a statistic, not a shadow on the street, but an actual person. Just as he was settling in, the door opened. Barron walked in, his expression casual, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told Michael he wasn't here just to chat. "We need to talk," Barron said, leaning against the doorframe. Michael stiffened, his mind racing. Was there some kind of catch? Had he missed something? He set his plate down and stood, ready for whatever was coming. "You owe me," Barron said, his tone light but firm. Michael froze. His heart sank like a stone. "Owe you? I don't have anything." Barron held up a hand, cutting him off. "Relax. I'm not asking for money or whatever you're imagining. Here." He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Michael. Michael took it cautiously, unfolding it to reveal an address scribbled in neat handwriting. "They're hiring," Barron explained. "Nothing fancy, but it's a start. You want to get back on your feet, right? This is your shot." Michael stared at the paper, his hands trembling. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Barron's expression softened. "Just a fraction." "Because someone has to," he said simply. Then, with a shrug, he added, "And because I think you can. Don't prove me wrong." For a moment, Michael was speechless. He looked up at Barron, and for the first time, he didn't see a privileged kid with more money than sense. He saw someone who believed in him. Barron clapped him on the shoulder, his usual confidence back in full force. "Get some sleep. You're gonna need it." As the door closed behind him, Michael sat back on the bed, clutching the paper like it was a lifeline. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: hope. That night, as he lay in the warm bed, Michael knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was a chance to start over, and he wasn't going to waste it. What would you do in Michael's place? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments, like and share to spread this message of hope and kindness. This story was created to raise awareness and inspire change. Your voice matters.